A generation ship is a vessel built to cross deep space without ever exceeding the speed of light. Whoever launches it will never see it land. Only their great-great-grandchildren might, and only if the ship survives that long. And if those descendants still want to arrive at all, NASA studied this exact scenario in 2018 and reached a conclusion most people assume belongs to science fiction. It might actually be survivable. Barely. The nearest potentially habitable star sits 4.2 light-years away. At the fastest speed any spacecraft has ever reached, the crossing would take over 70,000 years. Compress that with our most advanced proposed propulsion, and the number still does not fall below 300 years. Tonight, we'll trace the exact reason the crew-size math was wrong for 60 years. The single system failure that kills a generation ship faster than any radiation ever could, the generation on board who will never see Earth or the destination, and the one design choice that decides whether the whole mission survives. By the end of tonight, you'll understand exactly why the hardest part of leaving Earth was never the leaving. If this is the kind of night you return to, subscribe. It helps this quiet universe keep growing. Let's begin. Picture the crew manifest for humanity's first-generation ship. A captain, an engineering team, a doctor, a dozen or so families, sharing meals in a garden module lit to look like late afternoon. Somewhere around 150 people, in total. That number is real. It comes from a 2002 calculation by an anthropologist named John Moore, who tried to answer a genuinely hard question. How few people do you need on a ship to keep a population genetically healthy across 200 years of total isolation? He built a model, ran the numbers, and landed on 150 to 180 people. For years, that figure became the standard. Largely unquestioned, science fiction had already guessed something close to it. Now it had math behind it. Nobody uses that number anymore. Not because 150 is a small crew, because the model was wrong in a specific, findable way. Here's what almost nobody considers. Moore's model imagined a ship as a stable village, drifting gently through the dark. No epidemics, no radiation spikes, no failed harvests, no accidents, just birth, death, and marriage, generation after generation, in perfect demographic calm. Real closed populations do not get that kindness. And a multi-century voyage is not a calm village. It is centuries of exposure to every kind of disaster. A sealed, fragile system can suffer when later researchers rebuilt the simulation and fed in catastrophe. A lost harvest here, a radiation event there, an epidemic that kills a tenth of the crew in a single season. The required population did not rise gently. It jumped. Some models put the real minimum closer to 10,000 people. Others, modeling harsher conditions, closer to 40,000. Let that arrive slowly. Not a village anymore. A small city, sealed inside a hull, expected to stay genetically healthy, socially stable, and biologically intact for longer than most nations in human history have managed to survive on an entire planet, with an entire living biosphere to absorb their mistakes. Here's the part that changes everything. 40,000 people isn't really a comfort number or a room and supplies number. It's a genetic insurance number. It's the amount of unrelated ancestry you need, spread across enough founding families that inbreeding and hereditary disease don't unravel the mission 100 years after the ship is too far from Earth to turn back for help. You are, right now, one of roughly 8 billion ongoing genetic experiments that Earth runs without anyone designing it that way. A planet's living biosphere absorbing disaster, disease, and bad luck at a scale no single vessel could ever replicate. A generation ship would have to do, deliberately, by hand, in a machine a few hundred meters long, what an entire living world does for us by accident, every single day. Without our notice, 40,000 people also means 40,000 ways for something to go wrong that 150 never would have revealed. More politics, more disagreement, more competition for the same sealed air. The population problem wasn't really about genetics at all. It was the first sign that everything about this journey scales upward in ways nobody wanted to budget for. No one aboard will ever see where the ship is going. Not the founders who ran these numbers, not their children, or their children's children. Whoever finally arrives will be a stranger to everyone who made the decision to leave. And the population problem alone was enough to sink most of the early generation ship proposals, without a single engine ever being built. It was only the beginning of what the math had gotten wrong. Every closed system fails eventually. Not might fail will. Seals degrade. Filters clog. Metal fatigues. A space station like the ISS gets resupplied every few months, precisely because nothing built by humans holds a perfect seal forever. And Earth is close enough to send spare parts when something breaks. A generation ship gets no such visits. Once it leaves, the only spare parts it will ever have are the ones it was launched with, or the ones its own workshops can fabricate from raw materials centuries later. So the ship has to be built to survive its own aging. Not just the aging of the people inside it, the aging of the hull, the wiring, the reactor, the recycling loops that turn breath back into air and waste back into water. Engineers call this the maintenance problem. And on a normal spacecraft, it is solved by replacement. Swap the part, keep flying. On a 300-year voyage, replacement eventually runs out of spares, and the ship has to become its own factory, forging new components from asteroid ore or scavenged material using knowledge that has to survive being taught, generation after generation, by people who have never seen the original engineers who understood the reactor best. Here's the detail almost no one budgets for. The hardest failures to survive are not the dramatic ones, not the hull breach, not the solar flare. The dangerous failures are slow. A filter that clogs 1% more each year. A seal that leaks a whisper of air nobody notices for a decade. By the time a slow failure becomes visible, it has often already consumed the margin that was supposed to absorb it. This is why serious generation ship proposals build in something that sounds strange at first. A scheduled catastrophe. Not a real one. A simulated one, a planned equipment failure, or a rationed resource crisis, run deliberately every few decades. So each generation practices surviving a crisis before a real one arrives without warning. The ship needs its people to remain skilled at emergencies they may never actually face, the way a body needs stress to keep its muscles from wasting away. Skip too many drills, and the first real disaster becomes the first one anyone alive has ever seen, with nobody left who remembers how the last one was survived, because there was no last one. Stay with that for a moment. A machine built to keep 400 people alive for 3 centuries has to be designed assuming its own builders will be dead before any of the mistakes in that design reveal themselves. No test flight, no prototype at the destination. One build, one crew, 300 years, and no way to call home and ask what went wrong. The engineering problem, in other words, was never really about propulsion or hull thickness, or how much water 400 people drink in a lifetime. It was about designing a machine that has to remain repairable by people who were never born when it was built, using tools that may not exist yet, for failures nobody currently alive can predict. Scientists who model this call it the intergenerational maintenance gap, and no closed-loop system humans have ever built. Not a submarine, not a space station, not even Antarctic research bases has been asked to close it for longer than a decade or two at most. A generation ship asks it to hold for 300 years without a single resupply. Longer than you could reasonably expect any single object you own today to still be working, let alone still keeping someone alive. Here is the quiet, unavoidable problem sitting underneath every generation ship proposal ever drafted. The people who launch the mission are not the people who will live most of it, and the people who live most of it never agreed to go anywhere. Think about what that actually means for a single human life. The founders, the first generation, chose this. They trained for it, said goodbye to Earth, and accepted every risk with open eyes. But their children did not choose it. Their children's children did not choose it. Somewhere around the 4th or 5th generation, every person aboard the ship is someone who was born inside a locked door, 300 years from opening, with no memory of the world their great-great-grandparents left behind, and no vote in the decision that put them there. Bioethicists who study this call it the informed consent problem, and it has no clean answer. You cannot ask an unborn person for permission. You cannot unlaunch a ship 3 generations deep into its voyage just because the current crew would rather have stayed on Earth. The mission, once begun, obligates people who do not yet exist to finish something they had no part in starting, which is not entirely unlike being born into any family, any nation, any inherited set of debts and duties, except multiplied by the complete absence of an exit. On Earth, an unhappy descendant can leave the family, leave the country, walk away and build something else. On a ship between the stars, there is nowhere way to walk to. The hull is the entire world. Here's what nobody tells you about how mission designers have tried to soften this. Some proposals include a formal exit ceremony for each new adult generation. A moment, once they come of age, where they are told the full truth of the mission and asked symbolically to accept it as their own. But it acknowledges, out loud, that consent given by great-great-grandparents does not simply transfer through DNA like eye color. Pause on that. Somewhere on a real ship like this, a teenager who has never once felt real gravity, never once breathed unfiltered air, never once seen a horizon that wasn't curved steel, will be handed the truth. None of this was their idea, and none of it can be undone. This is where the human problem stops being abstract and becomes the actual engine of everything that follows. A machine can be engineered, a crew size can be modeled, but a person who never agreed to spend their entire life, and quite possibly their death, that is not a problem physics can solve. And it is the first crack in the mission that no amount of population, math, or redundant machinery was ever designed to close. Every generation after the first inherits a debt they never signed for. Not a debt of money, a debt of distance, paid in decades by people who will never meet the ones who opened the account. Astronauts who spend 6 months aboard the International Space Station come home measurably different. Bone density in the hips and spine can drop by 1% or more for every month spent in low gravity. Muscle mass that took decades to build can soften in a season. NASA tracks this so closely that returning crews spend weeks in supervised rehabilitation just to relearn how to stand under a weight their own skeleton used to consider ordinary. 6 months does that. A generation ship asks a body to live an entire lifetime somewhere that isn't quite Earth gravity. In most serious designs, a rotating hab, spinning to fake a fraction of the pull you're feeling right now in your chair, at a strength engineers still argue about. Too little spin. And bones and muscles drift into slow decline the way an astronaut's do. Too much. And the inner ear rebels. And every generation grows up faintly nauseated in a home that has always, gently and without explanation, made them sick. Here's what those numbers don't tell you. A person can recover from 6 months. Nobody has ever tested what 40 years of it does, let alone what it does to a body that develops from a single cell inside that gravity, never having known anything else. Children born aboard would grow bones and hearts, and inner ears calibrated entirely to the ship. And by the time anyone arrives at a real planet, with real, unforgiving gravity, the descendants stepping off may be the least physically prepared humans in history to walk on solid, unmoving ground. Hold that thought for a second. The world they're arriving at might be the first true gravity well most of them have ever stood inside. there is a second, quieter cost that isn't about muscle or bone at all. The human body calibrates its sense of day and night to light. And light aboard a sealed ship is manufactured on a schedule someone else chose. Circadian rhythm, immune function, mood, all of it drifts slightly out of tune when the sun is a fixture instead of a star. On Earth, your body still runs on rules written by a star 93 million miles away, whether you've ever looked up or not. On a ship, that same rulebook has to be simulated, generation after generation, by machinery that has no biological memory of why any of it matters. None of this kills anyone quickly. It is a slow tax, paid in fractions of a percent, compounding across a lifetime, then compounding again across the lifetime after that. And slow taxes, on a mission with no resupply and no way home, are the ones that are hardest to notice until the bill comes due. Doctors who study long-duration spaceflight have a specific worry that rarely makes headlines: cardiovascular deconditioning. On Earth, your heart works against gravity every single day, pushing blood upward against a pull it never gets to ignore. Remove that pull for long enough, and the heart itself grows lazier, its walls thinning slightly, its rhythm shifting in ways that show up on returning astronaut scans, even after relatively short missions. Multiply that adaptation across an entire lineage that never develops in true gravity at all, and you get bodies slowly reshaped for a world that no longer exists anywhere they will ever stand. Bodies that may need generations of their own after arrival just to readapt to the very planet the mission was built to reach. There is no dramatic failure here to point a camera at, no alarm, no collision, no single moment anyone could call the disaster, just a slow, compounding renegotiation between a species shaped by one planet's gravity and a machine asking that same species to become something else, unremarked, one small percentage at a time for 300 years. Ask people what they fear most about deep space, and most say radiation, or a hull breach, or a rogue asteroid. Mission planners who model closed-loop survival fear something quieter: the air itself. A sealed ship has to scrub carbon dioxide out of its own atmosphere continuously, forever, with no outside air to dilute a mistake. The International Space Station already runs this exact system today, cycling air through chemical beds that capture CO2 before it builds to dangerous levels. And even there, with resupply ships arriving every few months and Earth a radio call away, scrubber failures have already happened more than once and counted among the most serious emergencies the station has faced. Here's the part almost nobody expects. Elevated carbon dioxide doesn't announce itself the way fire or decompression does. Studies on submarine crews and sealed test habitats found measurable drops in decision-making and judgment at CO, 2 levels far below what triggers any alarm. Level of impairment climbing quietly as the number creeps up, headaches and fog and irritability arriving before anyone thinks to check the sensor. A crew breathing slowly worsening air can spend weeks making steadily worse decisions about food, about repairs, about each other, without ever consciously noticing the air had changed at all. Not a dramatic failure. Not an alarm and a countdown. A slow, invisible drift in the one resource nobody can choose to stop needing, correcting itself only when the scrubbers are fixed, if anyone is still thinking clearly enough by then to find what's broken. This is why serious designs treat atmospheric chemistry as the single most heavily redundant system on the entire ship. Layered with backups on top of backups, monitored by machinery built to notice a shift, long before any human aboard would feel it. Radiation can be shielded. A hull breach can be sealed, but breathable air has to be manufactured, checked, and corrected every hour of every day for 300 years without a single uncaught failure. And unlike a meteor strike, this threat doesn't need bad luck to arrive. It only needs one generation to grow slightly less careful than the one before it. And it can already be present in the room before anyone notices they're no longer thinking as sharply as their grandparents did. Engineers who design these systems talk about something called graceful failure, a system built so that when it eventually breaks, it breaks slowly, with warning, instead of all at once. A scrubber bed can be designed to degrade for weeks before it fails outright, giving a crew time to notice, time to repair, time to fall back on a second and third redundant system. But graceful failure only works if someone is paying close enough attention to catch the warning. Generation after generation, for 3 centuries, without ever once growing complacent because nothing has gone wrong yet. That's the real hazard hiding inside this problem. Not the chemistry, the vigilance. A system can be engineered to warn its crew in time. It cannot be engineered to guarantee that crew keeps checking, year after year, decade after decade, long after everyone who remembers why the checks matter has been dead for generations. You have almost certainly skipped a small, boring maintenance task at some point in your own life, trusting nothing bad would come of it. On this ship, that trust is the entire hazard. In 1991, 8 people sealed themselves inside a 3-acre glass structure in the Arizona desert called Biosphere 2, intending to prove that a fully closed ecological system could sustain human life indefinitely. It was meant to run for 2 years as a rehearsal for exactly this kind of mission. It did not go as planned. Oxygen levels fell so far, so fast, that outside air eventually had to be pumped in just to keep the crew from dangerous hypoxia. Crop yields collapsed, and the collapse followed an order nobody had predicted. Pollinating insects died first, quietly, in the first months. Without them, particular crops that depended on pollination failed next, one after another, in a chain nobody had modelled. Ants and cockroaches, needing no pollinators and no particular care, multiplied instead, filling the ecological space the failing species left behind. Here's what changes everything about that story. It happened in 2 years, on Earth, with scientists outside able to watch, measure, and eventually intervene. The generation ship carries no outside. Its farms are not a backup food source. They are the only food source, for centuries, with no atmosphere beyond the hull to borrow oxygen from if the math runs short. A closed biosphere, it turns out, does not fail evenly. It fails in order, smallest, most specialized organisms first, then whatever depended on them, cascading upward until the failure reaches something a human notices on a dinner plate. By the time a crop shortage is visible to the people eating from it, the actual failure may have started years earlier, in an insect population nobody was watching closely enough. This is the least glamorous problem in the entire mission, and arguably the most dangerous. Radiation shielding can be engineered with mass and physics. A living, self-sustaining ecosystem, stable for 3 centuries with no ecologist ever consulted from outside, has never once been achieved by anyone, anywhere, for longer than a few years, and a generation ship's crops are not a convenience. They are the reason anyone aboard is still alive to worry about anything else. You already live inside a version of this experiment, and you've never had to think about it. Earth's biosphere has been running its own closed-loop food system for roughly 3.5 billion years, correcting itself constantly, absorbing extinction events, ice ages, and entire mass die-offs without ever fully collapsing. A generation ship gets none of that deep reserve of resilience. It gets whatever handful of species its founders chose to bring aboard, and however many decades of trial and error the first few generations can survive long enough to learn from. Some proposals try to buy insurance against this the same way they do for genetics. Frozen seed banks, backup insect colonies kept in reserve, entire redundant growing modules sealed off from the main farm in case of contamination. Every one of those backups is itself another system that has to be maintained, checked, and eventually replaced by hands that were never trained by the people who built the original. The uncomfortable truth researchers keep landing on is that no closed ecosystem humans have ever attempted has proven stable for more than a handful of years. And every one of those attempts had the option, however humiliating, of opening a door and asking Earth for help. A generation ship's farm has no such door. Its failures have to be caught, understood, and corrected using only the knowledge, tools, and species already sealed inside the hull the day it left. A wager placed once, 300 years before anyone will know for certain whether it paid off. Beyond Earth's magnetic field, space is filled with galactic cosmic rays, heavy, high-energy particles flung across the galaxy by exploded stars, moving fast enough to punch straight through spacecraft hulls and human tissue alike. NASA sets strict lifetime radiation limits for its astronauts precisely because of what these particles do to DNA. Breaks, mutations, elevated cancer risk that accumulates with every year spent outside Earth's protective field. A 6-month trip to Mars already pushes close to those limits. A 300-year voyage through deep space, with no planetary magnetic field to hide behind for the entire crossing, exposes every single person aboard for their entire life, and every life born after them, to a dose no astronaut in history has ever been allowed to accumulate. Here's the detail that turns this from a personal risk into a generational one. DNA damage in reproductive cells doesn't stay with the person who absorbed it. It can be passed forward into children who never left the ship, whose bodies inherit a slightly higher mutation load than their parents carried at the same age. Compounded across 10 or 15 generations, unshielded exposure could measurably shift the health of the entire population in ways no single lifetime would ever reveal on its own. This is why the heaviest, least glamorous part of any generation ship isn't its engines. It's its shielding, often proposed as a thick jacket of water or hydrogen-rich material wrapped around the crew's living quarters, absorbing high-energy particles before they reach a single cell. Water that could otherwise be drunk or split for fuel instead has to sit still, doing nothing but blocking a threat too slow to notice and too important to skip. Scientists who model this call it a multi-generational dose problem, and it has no elegant fix. You cannot shield your way to zero. You can only decide how much mass you're willing to fly for centuries, purely to slow down a kind of damage that never announces itself with a single dramatic moment, only with numbers. In a health record, that looks slightly worse with every generation that's checked. A strange fact, rarely mentioned. The safest place on the entire ship for this specific danger would likely be its very center, buried under the mass of every other system, every water tank, every layer of stored cargo, the way a basement shelters you from a storm better than an upper floor ever could. Some designs deliberately place sleeping quarters and nurseries at the ship's core for exactly this reason, using the machinery itself and the people's own supplies as a radiation shadow. It is a strange kind of comfort. The very mass required to keep everyone fed and hydrated for 3 centuries doubles, almost by accident, as the thing protecting their children's children from a threat that took generations to even measure properly here on Earth. Even with every layer of shielding a ship can reasonably carry, most models still project a measurably elevated cancer risk across the crossing. Not a certainty for any one person, but a shifted probability spread across thousands of people over hundreds of years. Nobody aboard chose that risk individually. It was accepted once, collectively, by founders who are no longer alive to answer for the decision, and it will be paid out quietly, in individual bodies, generation after generation, for as long as the voyage lasts. Every person who boards a generation ship on launch day becomes, without asking for the role, a founder of an entirely new, permanently isolated human population. Whatever genetic diversity exists among those founders is, from that day forward, the entire genetic inheritance every descendant will ever draw from. No new arrivals, no distant cousins to marry into, just the deck of cards dealt on day one, reshuffled for centuries. Population geneticists have a name for what happens next: the founder effect. Small founding populations tend to lose genetic diversity generation by generation, purely by chance. The way a hand of cards gets smaller and less varied, the more times you deal from the same shrinking deck without adding new ones. Isolated human populations on Earth, small island communities, certain religious enclaves that marry only within the group, already show measurably higher rates of specific hereditary conditions, purely from generations of limited genetic choice. A ship population, sealed for centuries with the same limited founders, faces the exact same math, with no neighboring village to marry into if a specific bloodline runs short of options. Here's what almost none of the early mission proposals wanted to say plainly. Solving this problem seriously means treating reproduction itself as something the mission has to manage. Some serious design studies propose frozen embryo banks carried alongside the living crew, periodically thawed to reintroduce genetic variation lost to drift. A kind of genetic top-up, timed and administered like any other maintenance system aboard the ship. Others propose algorithmically guided pairings, quietly steering who has children with whom, purely to protect the population's long-term genetic health. Not gradual, not a suggestion, a designed intervention into who has children, decided by people who died centuries earlier, applied to descendants who never agreed to have their most private choice treated as a maintenance item on a systems checklist. The population that finally arrives, whenever and wherever that happens, will not simply be the founder's descendants. It will be the specific product of every genetic decision made on their behalf, generation after generation, by an authority none of them ever elected, and most of them will never even learn existed. This is where the genetic problem quietly becomes a political one. Whoever controls the embryo bank, or the pairing algorithm, controls something no government on Earth has ever been allowed to hold outright: a say in who gets to have children and with whom. On a planet, a person unhappy with that kind of authority can leave, resist, appeal to some outside power. Aboard a sealed ship, the authority making that decision is the only authority there is, and its reasoning was written by people who are not merely far away, but centuries dead. You would likely never meet the people whose calculations shaped your own family tree. You would only meet the results, a partner selected, in part, by a formula. A child born, in part, because a chart somewhere said the ship's genetic diversity required one more birth in that particular bloodline, that particular year. Whether that counts as care or as control probably depends entirely on which side of the formula you were born on. A word can change shape within a single generation, and it rarely needs permission. Listen to a grandparent and a teenager in the same family, and you'll already hear it. Different slang, different rhythm, sometimes an entirely different meaning attached to the same old word. On Earth, that drift gets constantly pulled back toward a shared center, by school, by broadcast media, by simple daily contact with millions of other speakers, reinforcing the same standard. Nothing lets language wander too far before something drags it home again. A generation ship removes every one of those anchors at once. Linguists already have real, small-scale proof of what happens next. On Tristan da Cunha, one of the most isolated inhabited islands on Earth, English settled by a handful of founders in the early 1800s has drifted, over just a few generations, into a distinct dialect barely resembling standard English in its rhythm and vocabulary. Pitcairn Island, settled by mutineers from the ship Bounty and a small group of Polynesian companions, produced an entirely new Creole language within 2 generations, recognizable as descended from English, understandable to almost no outside English speaker at all. Those experiments involved a few dozen people, on a planet, with a shared sky and shared seasons, anchoring their new words to something real. A generation ship's population starts larger, but its isolation is total. No outside contact, no incoming media, no drifting sailors passing through with a different accent to compare against. Every influence shaping the ship's language for 300 years will come from inside the hull alone. Push that outward, past a single ship, into the whole span of the mission. If a few dozen isolated speakers can produce an unrecognizable dialect within 2 generations, a sealed population of thousands, isolated for 10 times as long, is not likely to still be speaking anything close to the Founder's language by the midpoint of the voyage. The words in the ship's own founding documents, the ones explaining why the mission exists at all, may need active translation long before the ship is even halfway to its destination. Mission planners who take this seriously have proposed something almost nobody expects from an engineering document. A standing group whose entire job, generation after generation, is to slow the drift down deliberately, reinforcing the Founder's vocabulary through ritual, recitation, deliberate teaching, the way a religion preserves an ancient liturgical language long after nobody speaks it at the dinner table anymore. It rarely stops the drift completely. At best, it buys the mission a few more generations before the words on the wall need footnotes to be understood at all. Here's what most people completely misunderstand about language drift. It isn't decay. Nothing is being lost so much as replaced, continuously, by a population still perfectly capable of communicating everything it needs to say to itself. The tragedy, if there is one, belongs entirely to the Founders, to a version of the mission's meaning that only ever made complete sense inside the heads of people who have been dead for centuries by the time anyone would think to ask them what they truly meant. Here's the part that stops being about vocabulary and starts being about memory itself. Language doesn't just carry words. It carries the specific shape of ideas that existed when those words were coined. A generation whose language has drifted far enough from the Founders may not simply mispronounce old terms. They may lose the ability to think in quite the way the mission's original designers did. The concepts sliding sideways along with the sounds that used to hold them. Mission archives can be translated, of course, updated generation by generation to stay legible, but something is lost in every translation that isn't lost in an original. A flatness, a slight drift from the exact intention of whoever wrote the first version. Compounding with each retelling the way a story changes slightly every time it's passed from one person to the next. 300 years, and dozens of translation passes later, will the crew arriving at the destination understand the mission the way its founders understood it? Or only a version of it, translated so many times that the original reasoning has quietly become something closer to legend? We still don't know. No isolated human population has ever been tracked for long enough, in total isolation, to answer what happens to institutional memory once every person who understood the original reasoning has been dead for 10 generations. And tonight, that's where we'll leave this particular question. Not resolved, just carried forward the way the ship itself will have to carry it. What we do know is this. Somewhere around the ship's midpoint, in most modelled scenarios, the population speaking on board would no longer be intelligible, without training, to anyone who boarded on launch day. The Founder's first language, the one spoken at the ceremony when the ship left Earth, would have become, for everyone still alive to hear it, a language belonging to strangers, not gradually understood as a curiosity, genuinely foreign. A recording of the launch day speech, replayed centuries later for a population who has never set foot on a planet, may need subtitles to be understood at all. The exact words meant to explain to them why they exist, translated back into their own hands as if arriving from somewhere else entirely. Consider what that does to the mission itself. Underneath all the engineering, a generation ship isn't just carrying people and cargo across the dark. It's carrying an idea. The reason any of this was worth doing in the first place, and trying to keep that idea intact inside minds that will, by simple linguistic drift, stop being able to fully receive it in its original form. Every other system aboard has a backup, a redundancy, a second unit waiting in case the first one fails. Meaning has no such spare part. It either survives the translation, generation after generation, or it doesn't. Nobody watching from Earth would ever know which outcome had occurred until the ship either arrived carrying its purpose intact, or arrived as a population that no longer entirely remembers why it came. Whatever you were told as a child about why your own family does the things it does has likely already drifted this same way. In miniature, more than once. No one aboard still remembers what the ship left behind, not because anyone forgot on purpose. Because memory, without a place to anchor it, behaves the way light does in deep space. It keeps traveling, but it fades. And after enough distance, what arrives is too faint to recognize as what was sent. Sociologists who study isolated, multi-generational communities have watched this exact drift happen on a smaller scale, on Earth, in places sealed off less completely than a ship, but sealed off all the same. Founding stories that begin as plain historical accounts. A difficult crossing, a hard winter, a leader's specific decision tend to accumulate significance with each retelling. Details sharpen into symbols. A leader's practical choice becomes, a few generations later, something closer to a moral lesson, or a commandment, or a miracle. Nobody sits down and decides to turn history into scripture. It happens the way sediment becomes stone, slowly, under pressure, without any single moment where the transformation was chosen. Here's the part almost no mission designer wants to plan for directly. By the third or fourth generation aboard a ship like this, the founder's original reasoning, the actual scientific, political, and economic case for the mission, is likely to have calcified into something closer to a creation story. Departure day becomes a holy date. The founders become ancestors, spoken of with reverence, rather than colleagues who made calculated, fallible decisions. The mission's actual purpose, whatever chart or manifesto justified it, competes for space in people's minds against a version of events that feels better to believe. This isn't a flaw unique to a spaceship. It's what every isolated human group does with its own origin, given enough time and distance from the original event. What makes the ship's version dangerous is that the myth and the mission are not necessarily aligned. A population that has come to understand its journey primarily as a sacred calling, rather than an engineering project with hard technical requirements, may make very different decisions when a crisis demands cold, technical trade-offs instead of faith. Consider what happens when the ship's actual technical manuals, the ones explaining exactly how the reactor works or why the crops are planted in a specific rotation, sit alongside a founding story that has taken on the weight of scripture. Two versions of the same history, one dry and functional, one sacred and symbolic, occupying the same archive, read by the same population for centuries. Engineers trained to trust the manual may find themselves governed by leaders who trust the scripture instead. Especially in a crisis, when people reach first for whatever explanation feels most solid under pressure. And this is where it gets hard to predict cleanly. A shared myth can also be exactly what holds thousands of people together through centuries of monotony and risk that pure technical briefings never could. The same drift that blurs the mission's original reasoning may be the only thing keeping a population motivated to maintain it at all. Generation after generation, long after the founders' spreadsheets and mission logs have stopped feeling like anything except old dry paper. You likely already trust a version of your own history that has been shaped this same way. More myth by now than transcript. Every human government that has ever lasted more than a generation has had to change its own laws at some point to survive contact with a world its founders didn't anticipate. A generation ship's founders face something stranger. They have to design a legal and political system for a society that will exist entirely after they're gone, shaped by problems that don't exist yet, populated by people whose values may bear only a distant resemblance to their own. Political scientists who've studied this call it the founding paradox of long-duration missions. Write the rules too rigidly, and you guarantee a crisis 200 years later, when circumstances the founders never imagined collide with laws that allow no room to adapt. Write the rules too loosely, leaving room for future generations to reinterpret everything. And you risk a slow slide into whatever political structure the strongest faction aboard prefers, with no outside authority to appeal to if that structure turns authoritarian. Here's the detail that separates this from ordinary politics. On Earth, a bad government can eventually be escaped, overthrown, or outlasted. Because there's an outside, other nations, other systems, somewhere to flee to or appeal to. Aboard a sealed ship, there is no outside. Whatever political system takes hold by the second or third generation is, for practical purposes, the only political system anyone aboard will ever know, unless it is dismantled from within by the very people it governs. Some serious mission designs try to solve this with something like a constitution built to amend itself. Formal, scheduled reviews every few decades, mandatory generational conventions where the current population is required to reconsider and, if necessary, rewrite its own founding laws rather than simply inheriting them unquestioned. It is an attempt to build change into the system on purpose, rather than waiting for change to arrive as a crisis or a rebellion. Whether that actually works is something no one has ever tested for longer than a human lifetime. Every real government humanity has ever built has had the option of collapsing and being replaced by something entirely different, drawing on ideas from outside its own borders. A generation ship's government has no outside ideas to draw on. Every reform it ever makes has to be invented from within a population that has never once seen an alternative political system function anywhere else. There is a strange comfort some mission theorists find in this problem, even as they admit they can't fully solve it. A ship's government, precisely because it cannot appeal to any outside power, may be forced to develop unusually resilient forms of internal accountability, simply because there's nowhere else for grievances to go except back into the system itself. Whether that pressure produces something more just than Earth's governments, or something more brittle, is a question none of the founders will live long enough to see answered. Not gradual, not automatic. Every good outcome this system might produce depends entirely on people. Generations removed from the founders, choosing to take the responsibility seriously rather than letting power simply calcify in whoever happens to hold it when a crisis hits. Ask most people to imagine what goes wrong socially on a centuries-long voyage, and they picture mutiny, a dramatic uprising, a faction seizing control, a struggle for the ship itself. Real isolation research points somewhere far less cinematic and far more dangerous: apathy. Psychologists studying Antarctic research stations, submarine crews on long deployments, and simulated Mars missions have documented a consistent pattern in small, sealed populations facing years of monotony with no real escape. It isn't usually rage that breaks people down. It's a slow flattening of motivation, a gradual withdrawal from tasks, relationships, and even basic self-care as the mind adapts to an environment that offers no real novelty and no real way out. Researchers call it a version of learned helplessness. After enough time in a situation you cannot change and cannot leave, the mind conserves effort by simply caring less. Pause on that. A generation ship isn't asking a crew to endure this for a 2-year deployment, the way a submarine crew does, with a return date already scheduled. It's asking for centuries of it, inherited by people who never chose the deployment and have no return date to count down to at all. Mission psychologists who model this take it seriously enough to design entire systems around preventing it. Mandatory skill rotations so nobody's role calcifies into pure repetition. Ritual and ceremony scheduled deliberately to mark time and create meaning. Engineered scarcity of certain comforts so they remain worth working toward rather than becoming background noise. None of it eliminates the risk. It only slows the drift toward the flattened, going through the motions state that isolation researchers worry about far more than they worry about violence. But here's the question that keeps mission psychologists awake at night. A mutiny is loud. It announces itself, gives people something to respond to, fight, negotiate, or suppress. Apathy makes no noise at all. A ship could drift for decades with a population that has stopped caring whether the mission succeeds, still going through every required motion, still keeping every system running on schedule, while the actual will to arrive anywhere has slowly leaked out of an entire population with nobody left alive who remembers what it felt like to want this in the first place. There is no alarm for this. No sensor that measures collective will the way one measures oxygen or hull pressure. A ship's instruments would show a mission proceeding exactly on schedule. Every system nominal, right up until the moment a population that had stopped believing in its own purpose finally had to make a hard decision. It no longer had the will to make well. Some proposals try to address this the same way they address boredom and monotony, purpose engineered deliberately into daily life, small competitions, honors, roles that carry visible meaning even in a sealed, repetitive environment. It helps, researchers who study isolation say, more than most people expect. It does not fully replace the thing every truly thriving community seems to need without being told. A reason, freely felt, to still care tomorrow about a destination nobody alive has ever seen. Here is the coldest arithmetic in the entire mission, and the one almost nobody wants to sit with for long. On any voyage lasting 300 years, most of the people who ever live aboard the ship will be born after Earth has become unreachable and will die before the destination arrives. Not the founders, who at least chose this and saw Earth with their own eyes. Not the final generation, who at least get to arrive somewhere. The generations in between, the fourth, the fifth, the sixth, the seventh, live and die entirely inside the crossing itself, with neither end of the journey ever within reach. Think about what an entire human life looks like under those conditions. You are born inside a hull. You grow up, fall in love, raise children, grow old, and die, all without ever once feeling a planet's wind, or an unfiltered sky, or soil that wasn't manufactured. Your entire existence is spent in the middle of somebody else's journey, a chapter with no beginning you witnessed, and no ending you'll live to see. Valuable only as a bridge between two moments, neither of which will ever include you. Bioethicists who study this call it, quietly among themselves, the transit generation problem, and it has no comfortable answer. You can build meaning into daily life aboard. Purpose, ritual, relationships, achievement, all the things that make any human life feel worth living regardless of where it happens. But you cannot give a transit generation the two things every other generation on the mission gets: the wonder of departure or the payoff of arrival. They get only the middle, the part every other kind of story treats as the least memorable stretch. You have never had to think about this, and that itself is worth sitting with for a moment. Every plan you've ever made, every goal, every hope for how your life unfolds, assumes you get to be somewhere when it matters, present for the parts that count. A transit generation is asked to build an entire life whose greatest achievement, if the mission ultimately succeeds, will be witnessed only by their descendants, centuries after they themselves are gone. Some proposals try to soften this by giving each transit generation smaller-scale departures and arrivals of its own. Engineered milestones, symbolic checkpoints, entire ceremonies built around events far less significant than reaching a new star, just so no single lifetime aboard has to pass entirely without one. It's a modest fix for an enormous problem, and mission designers who study it tend to admit, in private, that it may be the best anyone can offer people who will spend their whole lives in a chapter nobody else will ever read closely. Not slightly overlooked, almost never discussed. Among all the technical risks a generation ship has to survive, the transit generation problem is the one that involves no failure at all. No broken system, no miscalculation, no accident. Everything can work exactly as designed every year for 300 years, and this particular cost still gets paid in full, unnoticed by anyone outside it. inside the one life each of those people ever gets. No engineering review has ever flagged this as a defect, because it isn't one. It is simply what 300 years of continuous human habitation costs, paid out one ordinary, unremarkable lifetime at a time by people who did everything asked of them and still never got to see either end of the story they gave their whole lives to. Picture a proposal that sounds almost cruel until you understand the reasoning behind it. A generation ship deliberately engineered to let its population forget Earth, on purpose, as completely as possible. The logic isn't cruelty, it's focus. Mission designers who've studied the psychological cost of nostalgia in isolated populations noticed something counterintuitive. Constant reminders of a lost homeland, recorded messages, preserved landscapes, detailed histories of a world nobody aboard will ever see again, can deepen grief and longing rather than easing it, anchoring each generation's sense of loss to a place growing less and less relevant to the actual life they're living. A population endlessly mourning Earth, some argued, might make worse mission decisions than a population that has been allowed, deliberately, to let Earth become myth rather than wound. So a few serious proposals suggested the opposite of a memorial. Minimal Earth records, curated carefully, teaching only what's functionally necessary, while deliberately declining to preserve the emotional weight of everything left behind. Not deception, a kind of engineered forgetting, treating grief itself as a resource that has to be managed like air or food, rationed rather than left to accumulate freely across centuries. Not universally adopted, not without fierce internal disagreement among the people who designed these missions. Critics argued that a population raised without real knowledge of Earth loses something essential, the ability to fully understand why the mission exists, or to make an informed choice about their own relationship to a heritage quietly withheld from them by people who decided, on their behalf, that forgetting would hurt less. Here's what changes everything about this idea. It treats memory the same way the mission treats water, or air, or genetic diversity, as a resource to be engineered, rationed, and optimized, rather than something that simply belongs to the people carrying it. Whether a ship's population deserves to fully know what was left behind, or deserves to be spared the weight of missing it, is a question with no purely technical answer. It is, in the end, one more decision founders would be making for descendants who never got a vote. No design study has ever fully resolved which approach produces a healthier population by the time arrival comes. Some models suggest full historical transparency breeds resilience. A population that understands its origins clearly makes steadier decisions under stress. Others suggest that grief, left to compound freely across centuries, becomes its own slow poison, dragging attention backward toward a world that can never be recovered, instead of forward toward the one still waiting. Both positions have their defenders. Neither has ever been tested by an actual ship, actually 3 centuries deep into the dark, actually finding out which choice their ancestors made on their behalf. There is something almost tender in how seriously this question gets treated by people who will never meet the population it affects, founders arguing, decades before launch, over how much of Earth their unborn descendants deserve to carry with them. As if love for people who don't exist yet could be expressed only through the specific shape of what gets remembered, and what gets allowed, gently, to fade. No committee has ever had to make this exact decision before, for this exact reason. On behalf of people this far removed from the ones deciding, every choice about what to preserve and what to release is really a guess, made once, about what kind of grief a stranger 3 centuries away will be able to carry without it breaking something essential in them. Stars move. Not the gentle, seasonal shift of constellations rotating overhead. An actual physical drift through the galaxy, each star tracing its own path around the galactic center at speeds of hundreds of kilometers per second. Over centuries, a star's true position shifts by a measurable amount. Small on a human timescale, significant on the timescale of a multi-century voyage. A generation ship cannot simply aim at where its destination star appears to be tonight. It has to aim at where that star will be, centuries from now, when the ship actually arrives. A moving target, calculated using proper motion measurements refined over decades of careful astronomical observation, updated and corrected as the mission proceeds, because even small errors compound across a journey that long into a miss of real dangerous magnitude. Here's what makes this stranger still. The target isn't just moving in space. It may be changing in ways no telescope can currently detect. A star's habitable zone shifts slightly as the star itself ages. A planet's climate, its atmosphere, its very habitability can change meaningfully across the 3 or 4 centuries a crossing might take, through processes as ordinary as a slowly brightening star, or as unpredictable as a planet's own geological and atmospheric history, unfolding on a timeline nobody watching from Earth can fully anticipate before departure. We still don't know, for any specific candidate world identified today, exactly what conditions will greet a ship that departs based on centuries-old observations. The world that looked promising through Earth's most powerful telescopes at launch may look different by the time anyone arrives close enough to check again, and there would be no way to know, no way to turn back for a better option, until the ship is already committed to whatever it finds waiting. Some proposals try to hedge against this by building deceleration and course correction into the mission itself, keeping the option open to adjust the final approach based on updated observations gathered as the ship gets closer, when instruments aboard may finally be able to see the target world in far more detail than anything available from Earth. It buys the mission a second chance to check its own assumptions. It does not buy certainty. By the time anyone aboard can see the destination clearly enough to know for certain, the ship is already most of the way there, with very little fuel left to go anywhere else. Think about what that means for whoever is aboard during that final approach. Every telescope on the ship pointed at a single star. Decades of accumulated hope resting on the difference between a habitable world and a barren one, with no way to turn the ship around, and no second destination waiting nearby if the first choice was wrong. Everyone who ever worked on this mission, across every generation, will have been building toward a moment none of them control. What a handful of instruments happen to detect, on one specific approach, after everything else has already been decided and can no longer be changed. You have almost certainly committed to something this way yourself, fully. Before you could know for certain it would turn out to be the right call, the space between stars looks, from any reasonable distance, like nothing at all. Even the emptiest stretches of interstellar space contain scattered atoms of hydrogen and helium, along with dust grains left behind by dying stars, drifting at low density but never at zero, at the speeds a generation ship would need to reach to make the crossing survivable within a human-relevant timescale. A meaningful fraction of the speed of light. Even that thin, scattered material becomes dangerous. Not gradual, not gentle. A single dust grain, no larger than a grain of sand, striking a hull at a significant fraction of light speed, carries kinetic energy closer to a small bomb than to anything we'd normally call a collision. Engineers who study this call it the interstellar erosion problem, and there is no way to fully avoid it, only ways to survive it longer. Leading-edge shielding layered ablative material, sacrificial outer hulls designed to absorb and vaporize incoming particles before they reach anything vital can hold off the damage for a while. But every impact, however small, chips away at that margin. A little more each year, across 300 years of exposure at speed. Hold that number, a single grain of sand, moving fast enough, hits like a bomb. Now imagine a ship spending centuries inside a field of them. The uncomfortable truth mission designers keep returning to is that the shielding needed to survive interstellar erosion for centuries adds enormous mass to the ship, which in turn demands more fuel, more propulsion, more of everything else the mission already struggles to carry. Every gram of protection against the emptiness of space is a gram that has to be launched, accelerated, and carried the entire distance. A tax paid not against a dramatic asteroid strike, but against space that looks, to anyone glancing out a window, like it isn't doing anything at all. You'll never feel this danger the way you'd feel a storm or a fall. From inside the ship, the whole 300-year crossing would look, through any window, like absolute stillness, stars barely shifting. The dark, unchanging night after night, decade after decade. The true violence of the crossing is happening entirely on the hull's outer surface, atom by atom, invisible to anyone living comfortably a few meters further in, behind however many layers of shielding the founders decided, centuries earlier. There's something almost merciful in that arrangement. Even if nobody designed it as mercy, the people living through the most violent physical environment a human body has ever survived would experience it as nothing more than a long, calm, unremarkable night. The danger absorbed entirely by machinery before it ever reaches anyone able to feel afraid of it. Nobody aboard would ever need to know how close that outer hull came to failing on any given decade. The instruments would know. The engineers scheduled to inspect the ablative layers would know. Everyone else would simply keep living inside a structure silently absorbing a centuries-long bombardment on their behalf without ever once feeling the impact. Human bodies renew themselves. Cells replace themselves on their own biological schedule, generation after generation, replacing the population entirely, so that, in a meaningful sense, the crew arriving after 300 years is nothing but new material, continuously refreshed from birth onward. The ship gets no such renewal. Metal fatigues. Seals harden and crack. Wiring insulation degrades under decades of radiation and thermal cycling. Every material scientists have ever tested shows measurable aging over long enough timescales. And a generation ship asks its structural materials to hold for centuries with no possibility of full replacement. Only patch, repair, and partial rebuild using whatever raw material and manufacturing capability the ship carries or can produce from what it gathers along the way. This creates an unsettling asymmetry at the heart of the mission. The people aboard are, biologically, essentially the same species that boarded on launch day, continuously renewed by birth. The ship itself is aging in ways no birth can reverse. A single, non-renewing object, growing steadily more fragile across a voyage its living cargo is, in a real sense, too young to remember starting. Materials engineers who study long-duration spacecraft take this seriously enough to design for what they call graceful degradation, accepting that by the voyage's final decades, significant portions of the original ship may need to be rebuilt entirely from scavenged or manufactured material. Using techniques and resources the founders could only guess at when they specified the original design. In effect, the ship that arrives may be, physically, a substantially different structure from the one that departed, repaired, patched, and partially reborn so many times that asking whether it's the same ship becomes less an engineering question than a philosophical one. There's an old idea, far older than spaceflight, about a ship whose planks get replaced one at a time until none of the original wood remains, and the question of whether it's still the same vessel at all. A generation ship makes that old puzzle literal, running for 3 centuries, with real consequences if the crew gets the answer wrong at the worst possible moment. The people who arrive will still, in every meaningful sense, be human, the same species that left Earth centuries earlier. The ship that carries them may not, by then, be entirely the vessel that left at all. Sit with the strangeness of that for a moment. A mission whose people stay recognizably themselves across centuries, while the vessel carrying them slowly stops being the thing that was launched, replaced piece by hands that never met the original builders. Ask, on arrival day, whether this is the same ship that left Earth, and the honest answer might be no. Only a structure descended from it, patched and rebuilt so many times over that the question stops being about metal and starts being about identity itself. And yet nobody aboard would ever describe it that way. In the moment, they would call it home. The same word their great-grandparents used for the same hull, now carrying different metal, different wiring, different generations who never once doubted it was the same vessel that had carried their family the entire way. You already call your own body the same thing, despite it replacing nearly every one of its own cells many times over since you were born. Every generation aboard a ship like this lives and works toward an outcome none of them, except possibly the very last, will ever witness. The founders built the mission on faith in numbers they could model but never verify. The transit generations maintained it on inherited purpose they never chose. Only the final generation, the one alive when the ship finally reaches its destination, if it ever does, gets to learn whether 300 years of decisions, sacrifices, and quiet maintenance actually amounted to anything at all. That is an extraordinary weight to place on people who, in every other respect, will have lived lives functionally identical to the transit generations before them. They didn't work harder, they didn't sacrifice more. They simply happened to be born into the specific decades when the ship's long arithmetic finally came due, and by pure accident of timing, they become the only humans in the mission's entire history who get to find out if it was all worth it. Psychologists who think about this describe a strange, specific pressure facing that final generation. An entire mission's meaning resting on an outcome they had almost no personal hand in creating, arriving at a destination shaped by decisions made by people who died centuries before they were born. Success or failure, in a very real sense, belongs to everyone who ever lived aboard the ship collectively, but only the last generation gets to feel it, one way or the other, in real time. And here's the part that's strange to sit with. Even success may not feel the way anyone imagined it would back when the mission first left Earth. The founders pictured arrival as their own personal triumph, a moment they themselves would witness. Instead, if the mission works exactly as intended, the people who feel that triumph will be complete strangers to the founders. People who never met them may barely understand their language and inherited their goal the way you inherit a family debt. Not because you agreed to it, but because it was already yours before you had any say in the matter. Whether that counts as a form of victory or a strange kind of loss folded inside one is a question the founders themselves never got to ask. Because by the time it would matter, none of them were alive to wonder. Every generation between launch and arrival will have carried a piece of that answer forward without ever holding the whole of it. Only the last one gets to set it down. There is no ceremony that fully accounts for that kind of debt. No medal large enough, no monument built centuries later by hands that never touched the original hull. Unremembered generation actually gave this mission simply by living out an ordinary life inside it, asking for nothing back in return and expecting none. Whatever arrives at the destination, whatever star finally comes into view close enough to matter, will be standing on the accumulated, uncelebrated effort of every one of those unremarkable lives. Not the founders alone, not the final generation alone. All of them, together, in a way no single monument could ever properly divide credit for. That's a strange kind of achievement to hold. An entire mission's success, if it comes, will belong most of all to the people history remembers least. The ones in the middle, whose names, if they're recorded at all, will sit unremarked in a ship's log next to thousands of others exactly like them. In 2011, a small group of scientists and engineers formed something called Project Hyperion, run through an organization named Icarus Interstellar, with a deliberately unglamorous goal. Take every problem you've just heard about and see how far real engineering could actually get towards solving them, on paper, using only physics we already understand. The lead researcher, a physicist named Andreas Hein, working alongside a team that included propulsion specialist Kelvin Long, didn't start with the exciting question: How fast could a ship go? They started with the boring one. How many people, exactly, would a closed, self-sustaining habitat need to remain socially and genetically stable for centuries, assuming everything else about the technology worked? Their answer, after running the numbers seriously, landed close to the same range other researchers kept arriving at independently. Tens of thousands, not hundreds. Here's the detail that makes this project worth knowing about. Rather than just another thought experiment, Hyperion didn't stop at population. The team modeled internal architecture, radiation shielding, artificial gravity through rotation, agricultural output, and social governance structures, treating the mission the way an actual engineering firm would treat a genuinely enormous infrastructure project. Not a fantasy, but a set of interlocking, solvable constraints, each one expensive, each one demanding trade-offs against every other requirement on the ship. What the project found, over and over, was not that a generation ship is impossible, it's that a generation ship is achievable only if every single subsystem is treated with the same seriousness usually reserved for the propulsion system alone. The crops as rigorously engineered as the reactor, the social contract as carefully drafted as the hull specifications, the language preservation plan considered as essential as the radiation shielding. There's something worth sitting with in how ordinary this makes the mission feel. At least on paper. Not a miracle, not science fiction hand-waving, a vast, expensive, and stubbornly difficult engineering project. The kind humanity has attempted before, at smaller scales, and occasionally gotten right. The team behind Hyperion never claimed they'd solved every problem. They claimed something quieter, and in some ways more useful, that none of the problems examined individually were unsolvable, only stacked together, across 3 centuries, with no chance to fix a mistake once the ship leaves. Hein has said, in interviews given years after the study wrapped, that the point was never to prove a generation ship is coming soon. It was to show that the idea deserves to be taken seriously by engineers, not just by novelists. That somewhere between science fiction and science fact, there's a body of real, rigorous work proving the concept isn't nonsense, even if nobody alive today will ever see it attempted for real. That distinction matters more than it sounds. A dream stays a dream until someone runs the actual numbers and finds out whether reality leaves any room for it. Project Hyperion didn't answer whether humanity will ever build a generation ship. It answered something almost as important, that the question is now an engineering question, not only a literary one. Long before anyone drew a blueprint for a generation ship, humans already ran something close to the experiment, without calling it that, without any physics beyond wind and current and the stars overhead. Beginning more than 1,000 years ago, Polynesian voyagers set out across the Pacific in double-hulled canoes, carrying entire founding populations: men, women, children, crops, and animals, toward islands they could not see and, in many cases, were not certain existed at all. Some voyages covered distances of well over 2,000 miles, navigated using wave patterns, star positions, and the flight paths of birds, with no possibility of turning back once far enough out and no way to call for rescue if the destination wasn't there. Here's what almost nobody connects to spaceflight, but should. Those voyages were, in miniature, exactly the same wager a generation ship makes. A small founding population, isolated completely from its point of origin, carrying everything needed to build an entirely new, self-sustaining society on arrival, with no guarantee the destination would be habitable at all. Some of those voyages succeeded spectacularly, populating islands across a vast stretch of ocean, developing rich, distinct cultures within a handful of generations. Some, historians and archaeologists suspect, simply vanished. Canoes and crews lost to a destination that either didn't exist or couldn't sustain them. The population sizes match with an eeriness that's hard to ignore. Genetic and archaeological research into the settlement of remote Pacific islands suggests many were founded by strikingly small groups, sometimes just a few dozen people. Numbers dramatically below what modern generation ship researchers consider genetically safe for long-term isolation. Some island populations did show measurable effects of that founder bottleneck for generations afterward. Others adapted, intermarried carefully, and thrived. You are, in a real sense, descended from a species that has already done a smaller version of this and survived it, more than once, without a single line of code or a single fusion reactor. The oceans of Earth were our first deep space. The canoes were our first generation ships, and long before anyone worried about cosmic radiation, our ancestors were already solving the harder problem underneath all of it. How do you carry a whole future and a whole culture somewhere you've never been, on a bet you can't take back? None of those voyagers had a word for what they were doing that would translate cleanly into colonization mission or genetic founder population. They likely had something closer to a story, a reason worth risking everything for, passed down orally, revised each time it was told, surviving the crossing the same way the people themselves needed to survive it. Whatever a generation ship carries in its databanks, it may still need something closer to that. Not just a manifest, but a story worth crossing an ocean of stars for. Every one of those island landfalls, whether it ended in a thriving settlement or in silence, began the same way this mission would. A small group of people deciding that an unproven destination was worth betting an entire bloodline on, launching into a horizon with no promise of what waited on the other side of it. Every population carries its own invisible ecosystem. Bacteria, viruses, and fungi living on and inside every human body, in numbers that outnumber the body's own cells. On Earth, this microbial world stays in rough balance, partly because it's constantly exchanged, diluted, and refreshed by contact with billions of other people, animals, and environments. A sealed population loses that constant exchange the moment the hull closes. Microbiologists who study isolated environments, submarines, Antarctic stations, even the International Space Station, have already documented something unsettling in miniature. Microbial populations in sealed environments drift measurably over time, sometimes becoming more resistant to standard treatments, sometimes shifting in ways that surprise the researchers monitoring them closely. Isolation doesn't just protect a population from outside disease, it changes the disease ecosystem already living inside it, evolving in a closed loop with nowhere else to go. Here's the detail that changes how you think about this. A pathogen sealed inside a generation ship for 300 years isn't fighting the same battle earthbound diseases fight. It has no other host population to spread to, no other environment to escape into if it becomes too effective and kills its hosts too quickly. In a strange, cold sense, the ship's isolation could push its own microbial world toward either much milder, more sustainable strains, since anything too lethal burns through its only available population, or toward far more dangerous new mutations. Incubated in a sealed system with limited medical resources and no outside expertise to call on. No serious mission proposal treats this lightly. Most include not just a hospital, but something closer to an evolving research institute. Geneticists and physicians trained specifically to track the ship's own internal microbial drift, generation after generation, watching for exactly the kind of subtle mutation that, left unnoticed for a decade, could become the one crisis a sealed population with no ability to quarantine itself from the rest of Earth can least afford. There's a strange kind of intimacy in this problem that no other threat on the ship shares. Radiation comes from outside. Structural fatigue comes from the hull itself, but the diseases this population may eventually face will have evolved from nothing but their own bodies, shaped entirely by their own isolation. A danger the ship's population would, in the most literal sense, have grown themselves, one generation at a time, without ever intending to. There is no outside strain to blame, no distant outbreak to trace back to its source. Whatever eventually threatens the crew's health in the ship's later centuries will have been with them the entire time, rewriting itself slowly inside bodies that never once left home to catch it. In a way, the ship's own population becomes both patient and laboratory, running an open-ended experiment in human and microbial coexistence that no ethics board on Earth would ever be permitted to approve, simply because there was never anyone else available to ask permission from. Most engineering failures announce themselves quickly. A bad weld fails within years. A miscalculated stress load shows up in the first major storm. Generation ship design has a different, far crueler category of failure. The decision that looks completely sound for 100 years, then stops being sound without warning, for reasons nobody involved in the original choice could have observed in their own lifetime. Consider a single design choice made at launch. Which specific alloy to use in a structural component expected to flex slightly under thermal cycling, decade after decade. Materials science can predict fatigue behavior reasonably well over years, even decades. Predicting it accurately over 3 centuries under radiation exposure and thermal stress no laboratory on Earth can fully replicate for that long is closer to an educated guess than a certainty, however rigorous the original modeling was. Here's the part that should unsettle anyone who trusts engineering to always show its work. By the time a 300-year material assumption proves wrong, everyone who made the original calculation is dead. The generation discovering the flaw inherited a problem they had no part in creating, using knowledge the original engineers didn't have access to about a component built from processes they may not even remember how to reproduce. This is why the single design choice promised earlier tonight, the one that decides whether the whole mission survives, isn't a dramatic one. It's not the reactor or the engines or even the shielding. It's the philosophy behind every structural and material decision made at launch. Whether the founders chose components with wide, generous safety margins, deliberately over-engineered against exactly this kind of multi-century uncertainty, or whether they optimized instead for efficiency, weight, and cost, the way most real engineering projects on Earth are pressured to. A ship built with excess margin everywhere costs more, launches slower, carries less. A ship optimized tightly for its known requirements may carry a hidden failure, seeded at launch, that nobody alive to make the trade-off will ever be around to regret. There is no way to fully resolve this trade-off in advance, because it depends on information the founders simply cannot have. Exactly how the materials will behave 3 centuries into a radiation and thermal environment, no laboratory has ever tested for that long. Every generation ship ever proposed on paper has had to make this same wager, in the dark, on behalf of people who will spend their entire lives depending on a guess they never got to check. The unsettling part is how ordinary the failure would look whenever it finally showed up. Not an explosion, not a warning klaxon, a component simply performing a fraction worse than its specification promised, for reasons buried in a materials science paper nobody aboard has read in over 200 years. By then, the only people equipped to notice the drift in time would be whichever engineers happen to still be reading those old papers at all, in a ship where most attention has long since moved on to more immediate, more visible concerns. If you've ever kept reading a manual nobody else in the room bothered to open, you already know exactly who those engineers are. Radio waves travel at the speed of light, which sounds fast until you put real distance behind it. A message sent from a generation ship back to Earth, even in the mission's opening years, takes longer to arrive than most people expect, and that lag only grows relentlessly the further the ship travels, until the round trip for a single question and its answer stretches past a decade, then a lifetime, then longer than anyone aboard is likely to live. Here's the detail that turns this from an inconvenience into something stranger. At a certain point in the voyage, communication with Earth stops being communication in any meaningful sense at all. A message sent home when the ship is decades out will receive a reply only after the sender may already be dead of old age. Later still, entire generations will live and die aboard the ship without a single two-way exchange, completing within a single human lifetime. Mission communications planners call this the light lag horizon, and it isn't a gradual fade into silence. It's closer to a slow transformation of what communication even means. Early messages home might carry real questions, real requests for advice, genuine two-way dialogue stretched across years. Later messages become something closer to historical broadcasts, updates sent outward with no real expectation of a timely reply, received by an Earth that may, by then, contain entire generations who never knew the ship personally at all, treating its transmissions as distant news from a mission most people have stopped actively following. Think about what that does to the crew's sense of being watched or cared for by the world they left. The founders left knowing Earth was, for practical purposes, already lost to them the moment real dialogue became impossible. Their descendants inherit something even stranger, an Earth that exists, technically, still sending occasional signals, still technically reachable by radio, and yet functionally as unreachable as if it no longer existed at all. A homeland reduced to old news, arriving too late to matter, about people who have long since moved on from thinking about the ship at all. You already live with a distant, gentler version of this. Sunlight reaching your eyes right now left the sun roughly 8 minutes ago. The star itself has already moved on from the version of it you're seeing. A generation ship simply stretches that same small delay, already built into everything you've ever seen, until the gap becomes wide enough to swallow entire human lives whole. Somewhere aboard, in the ship's final generation, someone will receive a message recorded by a person who has been dead for 100 years, addressed to a you. The sender pictured as a near stranger 3 centuries in the future, hoping only that whoever heard it would still recognize themselves as part of the same unbroken family the message was sent from. That gap, stretched far enough, turns every message into something closer to a letter left for someone not yet born than a conversation between 2 living people. Earth, on the other end of that same delay, would be doing something similar in reverse, sending updates to a ship it can no longer meaningfully picture as still containing anyone it once knew. 2 civilizations, still technically in contact, still exchanging words across the dark, and yet each one talking, in practice, mostly to a memory of the other rather than to anyone actually listening in real time. Every closed system loses a little useful energy every time it does anything at all. Physicists call this the second law of thermodynamics, and there's no negotiating with it. Heat spreads out, order tends toward disorder, and every process, however well designed, sheds a small amount of the energy that could otherwise have been put to use. On Earth, this cost is nearly invisible, subsidized endlessly by an enormous, continuous supply of energy arriving free every day from the Sunday. A generation ship carries no such subsidy. Every joule of energy available for the entire 300-year voyage has to be generated, stored, or harvested from onboard reactors and whatever limited external sources. Starlight in the early years, almost nothing in the deep, dark middle of interstellar space. The ship happens to pass through. Here's what almost nobody accounts for in the early excitement of designing engines and life support. The ship isn't just fighting distance, it's fighting entropy itself for 3 centuries in a system that can never be resupplied with fresh energy from outside once it's far enough from any star to matter. Every inefficiency, every bit of heat lost to friction, every joule wasted in an imperfect recycling process is a permanent loss from a finite total budget that has to last the entire crossing. This is why energy efficiency on a generation ship isn't a nice-to-have feature the way it often is on Earth. It's closer to a second currency, tracked as carefully as food or water, with every system aboard competing for a share of a supply that can never be topped up. A society used to treating energy as abundant, the way most of Earth does today, would have to learn something uncomfortable very quickly, that every convenience, every comfort, every luxury aboard draws down a reserve nobody on the ship can ever refill, fighting a losing thermodynamic war that can, at best, be managed, never won. It is a strange kind of humility a ship population would be forced to learn early and never unlearn, that unlike the world their ancestors left, where waste could be absorbed by a whole living planet and a whole indifferent star, every erg of energy spent aboard the ship is subtracted, permanently, from a total that was fixed the moment the hull sealed and the engines first fired. There is no equivalent, on Earth, to running out of Sunday. Aboard the ship, in the most literal sense available to physics, that is exactly what a poorly managed energy budget would eventually mean. Every celebration, every extra light left on a little longer than necessary, every small comfort chosen over strict rationing becomes a decision made against a ledger with no way to ever add funds back in. The ship's engineers would come to know the word enough more intimately than any population in human history ever has. Earth never had to teach its people that lesson so starkly, because Earth never ran out of anything essential fast enough for most of its inhabitants to notice or care. A ship's engineers would not have that luxury for even a single generation. They would learn to treat abundance itself as something to be rationed, long before scarcity ever forced the lesson on them directly. A discipline every generation aboard would have to relearn for itself, since no single lesson, however well taught, seems to stay taught forever without the scarcity that first demanded it. Comfort, on a ship like this, would always be borrowed against a future nobody aboard gets to see in full, repaid without complaint by generations who never asked for the debt in the first place, and never once thought to resent the ones who left it for them to carry. Every convenience you enjoy today was paid for the same way, by people who never met you and never asked to be thanked. A single founding culture, sealed inside one vessel, does not necessarily stay single. Human societies on Earth, given enough time and enough internal distance, geographic, ideological, or simply generational, tend to split into distinct subcultures, each developing its own values, rituals, and even its own version of shared history. A ship provides no geography to separate factions physically. It provides something else instead. Departments, decks, professions, and ideologies, each capable of hardening into its own semi-distinct culture within the larger whole. Sociologists who study large, long-duration institutions, militaries, monasteries, multi-generational family businesses, already see this kind of internal forking happen in environments far smaller and far shorter-lived than a 300-year voyage. The engineering crews might develop a culture prizing precision, hierarchy, and technical rigor. The agricultural workers might develop something closer to seasonal ritual and rootedness. Given 10 or 15 generations of relative separation within the same sealed hull, these differences could calcify into something closer to distinct ship cultures, sharing a language and an origin, but understanding the mission's meaning in noticeably different ways. Here's what makes this dangerous, and also what makes it potentially valuable. Cultural diversity within a single population tends to produce resilience, more perspectives available when a genuine crisis demands creative solutions nobody anticipated. But it can also produce exactly the kind of internal faction and disagreement that a sealed, resource-limited population with no outside authority to mediate disputes can least afford during an actual emergency. Mission designers who take this seriously build in deliberate cross-training and rotation, moving people between departments and roles across their lifetimes, specifically to blur the lines that might otherwise harden into rival ship cultures. It's a modest counterweight against a very old, very human tendency, the same tendency that split single-language families into hundreds of distinct tongues and single religious movements into dozens of competing sects. playing out again in miniature inside a machine that cannot afford the kind of fracture it's historically produced everywhere else humans have ever settled. Perhaps the fracture cannot be prevented at all, only slowed. Perhaps a ship's culture is always going to become several cultures given enough centuries, the same way every human population in history eventually has, wherever it's settled for long enough to stop being one story and start being many. If that's true, the mission's real achievement may not be arriving as one unified people at all. It may simply be arriving as several, sharing one hull, one air supply, and one destination in roughly the same uneasy way most nations on Earth already do. There may be no version of this mission, however carefully designed, that arrives as the single, unified culture the founders imagined on launch day. Only a family of related ones, descended from the same beginning, sharing enough of the same story to still call themselves one people when it finally matters. It would not be the mission failing to hold together. It would simply be a mission behaving exactly the way every human population in history behaves, given enough time to become more than one thing. The same way your own family tree has already split into branches who barely resemble each other. Despite sharing the same distant beginning, every generation ship design has to answer an uncomfortable question early. At what point does turning back stop being possible? The answer, in nearly every serious proposal, arrives far earlier in the mission than most people expect. Reaching a meaningful fraction of light speed requires enormous amounts of fuel, whatever form that fuel takes: antimatter, fusion, or some sail-based method reflecting energy from distant lasers or the ship's own reactors. Nearly all of it is expended in two intense phases: the acceleration at the start of the voyage, the tard, and the deceleration needed at the end to actually arrive at the destination rather than simply passing through it at unsurvivable speed. Once the acceleration phase completes and that fuel is spent, the ship is, for all practical purposes, committed. Reversing course would require roughly as much fuel as the original acceleration took to produce, fuel that, by definition, the ship no longer has, because it already used it to get up to speed in the first place. Here's the part that should feel strange. Once you sit with it, that point of no return likely arrives within the first few years of a mission expected to last 3 centuries. Long before the founders have finished adjusting to life aboard, long before anyone has any real sense of how the crops, the social systems, or the population dynamics are actually going to hold up over time, the ship has already burned the only fuel that could have brought it home. Every subsequent decade of discovery, adaptation, and crisis happens after the decision has already, irreversibly, been made. We still don't know what it would feel like, psychologically, to live through that threshold as it happens. The last theoretical chance to turn back, already spent, with 290 years of consequences still ahead, and no one aboard yet able to know whether any of it was the right call. Some mission plans mark the moment with deliberate ceremony, naming it plainly for what it is. Others choose not to announce it at all, letting the point of no return pass in silence, technical and unremarked. Buried in a fuel log, nobody but the engineers ever bothers to read closely. Either way, the mission's entire remaining future becomes, from that moment forward, a single unbroken forward motion. No branching paths left to choose between. Only the long middle still waiting to be lived through, one ordinary day after another, by people who will spend their whole lives inside a decision made before most of them were even born. Every problem this journey still has to face, the bodies, the crops, the language, the law, the culture, the slow war with entropy, all of it unfolds after this point, inside a mission that has already, irreversibly, chosen to keep going. Nobody standing at that fuel gauge on launch day fully grasped what they were actually deciding. Not the destination, not the mission's success or failure. Only that, from that specific moment forward, there would be no version of the future that did not involve finishing what had already been started. Every problem covered up to this point has had an engineering answer, or at least an engineering attempt at one. Shielding for radiation, redundancy for the air, genetic vaults for the bloodline, cross-training for the culture. This one doesn't. It belongs entirely to what it feels like to be a specific, singular person, alive at a specific point in a 300-year crossing nobody chose for them. Picture someone born roughly 150 years into the voyage, squarely in the middle, further from Earth's living memory than from the eventual destination, and further from arrival than any current adult aboard will live to see. Their grandparents can no longer describe Earth from first-hand experience. Their own grandchildren will likely die before the ship arrives. Every person this individual will ever know, for their entire life, exists inside the same sealed hull, breathing the same recycled air, with nowhere further to travel to and no one further away to imagine reaching. Here's what almost never gets said plainly about isolation. It isn't measured only in distance. It's measured in how many people, anywhere, share your exact situation and could actually reach you if you needed them. Astronauts on the loneliest missions in history still had radio contact, however delayed. Antarctic researchers still had, eventually, a plane that could land. A person born in the ship's middle generations has neither, not because anything failed, but because the geometry of the mission itself places them at the single point furthest, in every sense, from any other human who could actually help. You have never experienced true isolation of this kind, and it's worth sitting with what that comparison reveals. Even your most solitary moment still shares a planet, an atmosphere, and a rough timeline with 8 billion other people who could, in principle, eventually reach you. The mid-voyage generations share their entire universe with only the few thousand other people sealed in the same hull. A complete human world, in miniature, with no possibility of anyone new ever arriving to expand it, and no possibility of leaving to find anyone else. And yet, every account we have of extreme isolation on Earth, submariners, winter-over researchers in Antarctica, prisoners held in solitary conditions for extended periods, suggests something almost defiant about how human minds respond to it. People adapt. They build inner worlds, invent rituals, find meaning in details that would seem absurdly small from outside. The middle generations of a generation ship would likely do exactly this. Not because the loneliness isn't real, but because it is, apparently, survivable in the specific way only a species built for adaptation could make it survivable. Not a tragedy waiting to happen. A cost, paid without ceremony by people who are not born yet, who will build entire, complete, meaningful lives inside the loneliest circumstance any human being has ever occupied, and who may never think to describe it as lonely at all, because it will simply be the only life they've ever known. Every problem tonight has assumed a specific version of the mission. Living human beings, born, raised, and dying aboard a moving ship for 3 centuries. Not every serious proposal makes that assumption. Some of the most carefully argued alternatives skip the generation part of generation ship almost entirely. One approach, sometimes called an embryo ship, proposes launching no living adult crew at all, only a small number of caretaker robots, a frozen bank of human embryos or genetic material, and an automated system designed to raise the first generation of humans only once the ship nears its destination, decades or centuries later. No multi-generational isolation problem, because there's no multi-generational population living through the crossing. No transit generation trapped in the middle, because there is no crew at all until arrival is close. Here's what makes this idea both elegant and deeply strange. It solves nearly every problem discussed tonight: the psychology, the governance, the culture drift, the loneliness of the middle generations. By removing the humans from the equation for most of the journey, what it introduces instead is a different kind of risk entirely. an automated system responsible for successfully raising the first human beings it has ever raised. With no adult humans present to correct its mistakes, no multi-generational wisdom to draw on, only whatever training and programming it received from engineers who will be centuries dead by the time the system's actual performance can be judged. A second, stranger proposal removes even the biology, digitized human minds, or some future form of consciousness storage nobody has actually built yet, carried across the void without needing food, air, or radiation shielding calibrated to a fragile body at all. If it ever becomes possible, this approach sidesteps almost every problem this episode has covered. At the cost of a question so large it barely fits inside an engineering proposal, whether whatever arrives at the far end would still, in any meaningful sense, be the same people who left, or something else entirely wearing their memories. None of these alternatives has ever been attempted, and each carries its own enormous unresolved uncertainty. But their existence says something worth holding on to. The crude generation ship, with all its centuries of inherited hardship, is not the only path being seriously considered. It may simply be the path most people find easiest to imagine because it's the only one that still looks, in the end, like an ordinary human family, however strange the ship around them becomes. Every alternative trades one set of unknowns for another. An embryo ship trades loneliness for the risk of a machine raising the first humans it has ever met. A digitized crew trades biology for a question about identity nobody has ever had to answer for real. There may be no version of this mission, however it's built, that arrives without asking its passengers, in one form or another, to bet something essential about what makes them human on an outcome none of them can verify in advance. You've made smaller versions of that same bet already, more than once, without ever needing a spaceship to do it. Two objects, launched in 1977, are already doing something close to what this entire episode has described. Not carrying people, but carrying a message, moving continuously outward, expected to keep traveling long after everyone who built them, and everyone who will ever remember them, is gone. Voyager 1 and Voyager 2 have already left the heliosphere, the bubble of particles and magnetic field the sun projects around itself, entering true interstellar space, the same environment a generation ship would eventually have to cross. Each carries a golden record, recorded greetings in dozens of languages, music, images of Earth, assembled by scientists who understood, even in 1977, that these probes would likely outlast every human civilization that built them, drifting silently for longer than our species has existed. Here's the detail that connects this directly to tonight's subject. The Voyager probes carry no crew, but they carry something closer to a founder's message than almost anything else humanity has ever launched. An attempt to speak to whoever, or whatever, might eventually intercept them, centuries or millennia after the last person who understood the original context has died. In that narrow sense, they are already living the exact problem the founders of any crude generation ship would face. How do you make yourself understood by a listener you can never meet across a gap of time too large to bridge with anything except a single, carefully chosen message? Both Voyagers are expected to keep drifting through the galaxy for billions of years after their instruments finally go silent, a span of time that makes even the 300-year crossing this episode has focused on look almost immediate by comparison. In a strange way, they may be the most successful generation ships humanity has ever launched, carrying not living descendants, but an idea of who we were, moving forward through the dark, long after every one of us and every one of our actual descendants is gone. No one designed the golden record expecting a reply within any human lifetime. The scientists who assembled it accepted, from the very beginning, exactly the kind of one-way, unwitnessed hope that every generation ship's founders would eventually have to accept as well. That the message matters, whether or not anyone alive to send it ever learns what became of it. 2 small, unmanned machines launched decades before anyone seriously drafted a crewed generation ship may end up being the closest thing to proof that this entire kind of mission is possible, not because they carry a living crew, but because they've already demonstrated that something built by human hands can keep moving meaningfully long after everyone who understood why it mattered has gone silent, long after the last engineer who worked on either spacecraft has died. Both Voyagers will still be exactly where their launch trajectories sent them, carrying exactly the message they were given, asking nothing back from the dark they're moving through. Look back at everything this episode has traced. The population math, the failing air, the drifting language, the fractured law, the lonely middle generations, the aging hull outliving its own crew's memory of launch day, and a single pattern sits underneath all of it. Easy to miss when each problem is examined on its own. Every one of these failures, at its root, is the same failure. Something built to be understood, cared for, or sustained by a single witness, asked instead to survive being handed to someone who never met that witness at all. The population math fails because founders modeled a stable village instead of the disasters no single witness could fully anticipate. The language drifts because meaning, coined by one generation, has to survive translation by every generation after it, none of whom shared the original speaker's exact mind. The law fails or holds depending on whether it was written for people the founders could actually picture, or for strangers they had to imagine without ever meeting them. Even the ship's hull, slowly replaced piece by piece, is really just this same problem in metal. A structure built by one generation, kept alive by hands that never learned from the builders directly. Not gradual erosion in each separate system, the same underlying wager made over and over in every subsystem of the mission. That meaning, memory, and care can survive being passed to someone who was never present for the moment they were created. This is, in the end, what every generation ship is actually testing. Not whether an engine can push a hull fast enough, or whether crops can grow reliably enough, though both of those things genuinely matter. It's testing whether anything a person builds, believes, or loves can survive contact with a gap of time wider than any single human life can bridge, carried forward only by people who never knew the original moment it began. Every engineering document this mission will ever produce is, underneath its charts and specifications, an answer to that one recurring question, asked in a different disguise each time. Can this survive being loved by someone who never met the person who first loved it? Ask that question enough times, across enough subsystems, and the whole mission starts to look less like a spacecraft and more like an act of faith wearing an engineer's clothing. Precise, calculated, and still, underneath all of it, a wager on something no equation has ever fully captured, carried forward one careful decision at a time. Seen this way, the population math and the language drift and the aging hull all stop looking like separate chapters in a long list of hazards. They start looking like the same story, told in 3 different vocabularies: biological, cultural, mechanical. Each one testing the exact same fragile, essential thing. Every specialist aboard, whether they work in genetics, linguistics, or structural engineering, would in some sense be doing the same job, keeping a single, continuous thread from snapping across a gap no one of them could bridge alone. Give that thread enough names: reactor manual, family story, founding law, and it stops resembling separate cargo entirely, becoming instead a single, fragile continuity, split into departments only because a ship's org chart has no better way to describe it. You carry a version of that same thread yourself in whatever you inherited without ever being asked if you wanted it. No one aboard ever needed to see where it was going. That sentence has followed this episode from its first minutes, quietly changing shape each time it returned. first as an observation about founders who would never see arrival, then as a statement about descendants who no longer remembered departure. Here, at the end, it means something different again, and it means it about you. You are, right now, riding a vessel roughly 25,000 light-years from the center of a galaxy that is itself hurtling through an expanding universe at speeds far beyond anything any generation ship's engineers have ever proposed. Earth orbits the Sunday. The Sun orbits the galactic center, a single loop taking around 230 million years to complete. Nobody alive today, and nobody who will ever be born, will witness so much as one full circuit of that orbit. In the strictest possible sense, you are already living aboard a generation ship, one launched roughly 4.5 billion years ago, carrying a crew that has never once, across its entire history, agreed collectively to board it. Here's what changes everything about that comparison. Earth's founders were nothing but physics and chance, indifferent to whether their passengers ever understood the journey at all. And yet every human who has ever lived has managed to build entire civilizations, entire languages, entire meanings, without needing to see the whole orbit, without needing to know the destination, without needing any promise at all that the journey serves some larger purpose visible from where they stand. A crude generation ship, built by hands, asks its passengers to do consciously, deliberately, and, with full awareness, something every human being who has ever lived has already been doing without realizing it. Building a complete life inside a single, small, moving section of an unimaginably larger journey, never seeing where it leads, and finding that this absence of an ending in view has never actually been the thing that made a life worth living. You were never waiting to arrive anywhere to make tonight count. Neither would they. Every civilization that has ever mattered to the people living inside it has mattered without needing to see its own end from the outside. A generation ship's population would simply be doing, deliberately and at scale, what every human community has always managed without ever giving it a name. The stars they were named after, the calendar they measure their lives by, none of it would need to resolve into a visible ending for any single life aboard to feel complete on its own terms. Completion, for them as for you, would be measured in what a life held while it lasted, not in whatever came after it. No one aboard would need Earth's answer to know that. They would simply live it, the way every generation before them already has, on this ship, and on the much larger one none of us ever agreed to board. If a generation ship ever does complete its crossing, the moment will not look the way it does in any story imagined from Earth. There will be no final generation standing at a window, watching a new world swing into view for the first time, carrying the emotional weight of everyone who ever hoped for this moment across 3 centuries. The people present at arrival will have grown up with the mission as simply the entire world they've ever known. Not a struggle toward a distant goal, but ordinary daily life, filled with ordinary daily concerns that have nothing to do with the destination they were taught about the way any child learns history. Second-hand, abstract, belonging more to their ancestors' story than their own. Arrival, for them, will not feel like the end of a long and difficult journey. It will feel like an unusually large change happening in the middle of lives that were already, in every practical sense, complete on their own terms. We still don't know how a population raised entirely inside transit would actually respond to that shift, whether it would feel like liberation, like loss, like an abstraction suddenly made real in ways nobody entirely wanted, or like something with no clean name at all, because no population in human history has ever made this specific transition before. Some mission psychologists suspect the final generation may need almost as much preparation for arrival as the founders needed for departure, an entirely new kind of training, teaching people who have never known anything but the ship how to eventually stop needing it. And here's the part that's hardest to resolve cleanly. Whatever this final generation feels, it will belong to them alone. not to the founders who dreamed of this exact moment and never lived to see it, not to the transit generations who kept the mission alive without ever getting to witness what it was for, only to the specific, ordinary people who happened to be born into the years when the long arithmetic of the mission finally came due, inheriting, in that single moment, an ending that was never really theirs to begin with, and somehow entirely theirs to complete. Whatever they feel standing at that threshold, it will not be closure in the way the founders imagined it. Back when the whole voyage was still just a plan on paper, 300 years and countless unborn lives away from becoming real. It will be, more likely, something closer to what any of us feels at the end of a life we didn't fully choose but still came to call our own. Not a triumphant final chapter, but a life simply finishing on its own terms, exactly the way ordinary lives do, full of days that mattered on their own, long before anyone knew how the whole story would end, and long before anyone truly needed to know. Not so different, in the end, from the life you are living right now. Ask what a generation ship is actually built to protect, and the honest answer isn't the hull, or the engines, or even the specific people who happen to be aboard at any given moment. Every one of those things changes, degrades, or dies along the way. The hull gets patched until it's barely the original structure. The founders die within decades of launch. Even the language spoken at arrival may be unrecognizable to the language spoken at departure. What has to survive, if the mission survives at all, is something with no mass and no fixed location. A reason passed from hand to hand, across centuries, specific enough to still mean something to people who never met the ones who first held it. Call it purpose, or memory, or story. The word matters less than the fact that it is the only cargo aboard the ship that was never subject to entropy, radiation, or genetic drift in quite the same way everything else was, and also the only cargo with no engineered redundancy, no backup system, nothing protecting it, except whether each generation chose, freely, to keep carrying it forward. This is what every problem covered tonight was actually circling, from the population math to the loneliest transit generations to the ship's own slow architectural rebirth. Not whether humanity has the engineering to survive a multi-century crossing, but whether meaning itself can survive being handed forward by people who never chose to receive it across a distance wider than any single witness can bridge. We don't know the answer. No population has ever completed this specific journey, and no simulation can fully substitute for 300 years of actual, lived, human uncertainty. What we do know is smaller and somehow larger. Every one of us is already living proof that meaning can survive a crossing like this, because every one of us inherited an entire world, an entire language, an entire tangle of purpose and care, from people who died long before we were born, who never met us, and who built anyway, not toward a guarantee, but toward the same quiet bet every generation ship's founders would eventually have to make, that someone, someday, unmet and unknown, would still find it worth carrying forward. That bet has already paid off once. It paid off in you, and whether or not humanity ever actually builds a ship like the one this episode has imagined, that same bet is already being placed again, tonight, in every ordinary act of building something for people we will never live to meet. A garden planted by hands that won't taste its fruit. A language taught to a child who will one day teach it to someone not yet born. A story, carried this far, about to be carried a little further, by you, into whatever comes after tonight, the same way it has always been carried, hand to hand, across every gap that ever separated one generation from the next. A generation ship is a vessel built to cross deep space without ever exceeding the speed of light. We started there tonight, with a ship that hasn't been built yet, crewed by people who haven't been born yet, crossing a distance most of us will never truly picture. We've drifted through population math that broke under its own optimism, through air that could turn dangerous without ever raising its voice, through crops that fail in a silence 4 billion years of Earth's biosphere has always quietly absorbed for us. Together, we've wandered through a language dissolving before its ship reaches the midpoint, through a law that has to bend without breaking, through generations who live and die in the middle of someone else's story, holding a purpose they never chose and somehow, mostly, choosing to hold it anyway. None of that was ever really about a spacecraft. It was about you, and everyone who came before you, and everyone who will come after. All of us riding the same kind of vessel, carried by a star none of us chose, toward an ending none of us will see, across a distance measured not in light years but in generations, we will never meet on either side. You are not waiting for a destination to make tonight matter. You never were, neither is anyone else, anywhere, drifting through their own small piece of this very long crossing. If your eyes feel heavy, let them close. That has never once been the failure of a night like this. It has always been the point. If this felt like home, leave a comment when you wake up and tell us which part of the journey you carried into your dreams. If you're still here, still awake, still listening, the next chapter is waiting, whenever you're ready for it. And if you're not, that's exactly as it should be. Some nights are for arriving somewhere. Tonight was for drifting, gently, towards sleep, carried the whole way by people who will never meet you and were thinking of you anyway. The universe will still be here when you wake up. So will we. Good night.